So I've had this system set up for a couple months now where I have a little recorder that plays background noise through a pair of cheap computer speakers just 24/7, you know? Which is actually really nice, except I then forget about it. So if I'm on a work call or something, or I start recording audio like this, I tend to forget. My face is much too large in the frame. I thought this... It's okay, the next one. The next one will be fine. Pooh's Grand Adventure, The Search for Christopher Robin, is a feature film-length home video released in 1997. And in hindsight, this was one of the most important animated movies of my childhood. First, some context, then we can talk about the movie. This was not a theatrical release, though honestly, for the time, I feel like it could have been. Pooh's Grand Adventure was directed by Carl Gers? Here's how it's spelled. He was an animation veteran who sadly died in 2022, and whose only directing credits, as far as I saw, are for home video releases exclusively for Winnie the Pooh related projects. Also, for the hardcore Pooh fans out there, that's Pooh with an H, fellas, this project is notable given how many of the classic voice actors are in the cast. John Fiedler as Piglet, Peter Cullen as Eeyore, Paul Winchell as Tigger, and Jim Cummings is not the original Pooh Bear, but I still think that his performance here is fantastic and very memorable in its own way. As for how this movie stands in the public consciousness, it feels similar to lots of other direct-to-video releases from around that time. The critical reception was bad, but very few critics tend to review direct-to-video stuff anyway, especially for this time. The audience reception was much better. But why do I care about it? And why should you? Maybe. I don't think that Winnie the Pooh is an especially strong brand at the moment, especially not in China. It's kind of in the same neighborhood as the Muppets and the Looney Tunes, I think. There's still plenty of goodwill and lots of nostalgia from certain age groups, but efforts to expand the audience have been largely unsuccessful. I am not trying to argue in favor of Winnie the Pooh generally, but I've been a fan since I was a kid, and I do think there's something special about some of the characters, and definitely something special about the 100-Acre Wood. The series has also carried forward this wordplay-based humor that simultaneously feels goofy and kind of highbrow.
Can you tie a knot?
I cannot.
Ah, so you cannot.
No, I cannot not.
Not?
Who's there?
And this movie, it's an hour and 20 minutes in runtime, so it makes the cut officially, is among the best Winnie the Pooh that we've ever gotten. I'm not saying it is the best, but it's in the top tier, despite being generally understated and apparently lost in time. Here's how I remembered this movie prior to rewatching it. It was long and overwhelming with a weird, dark vibe right up until the resolution, and basically none of that is true now as an adult. And I should say this was absolutely one of those VHS tapes that we watched many times over, for one thing, because that's what you had. We had Pooh's Grand Adventure, and we went through it many times. So coming back to this has been kind of exciting, and specifically because I wanted to see if it still felt all the ways that it felt when I was a kid. And long story short, in most of those ways, not really. For one thing, it's 80 minutes. This is not a long movie. The premise is simple. It's not overwhelming. And the weird, dark vibes are kind of still there, but they're nowhere near as intense as they were when I was a small child. But despite my drastically different perspective, I still really like the movie, which is why I'm making this video. So what's it about? We start with Christopher Robin and Pooh Bear just hanging out. This is what we expect from those characters. This is what we expect from their relationship. They're not really doing anything in particular, which quickly becomes a theme of the movie, just the idea of being such good friends with someone that you don't have to do anything.
It's when people say, "What are you two doing?" "Oh, nothing." And we do it.
So the next day, Christopher Robin doesn't show up to hang out, but there's a pot of honey with a note for Pooh. And of course, Owl is the only character who can read, and he proceeds to completely misinterpret the note, setting the cast off on a grand adventure. But because we, the audience, know how to read and spell, when we hear Owl say that Christopher Robin went to School, which he pronounces skull, we know how things are going to work out. Like we get the premise. We understand the misunderstanding and how things are going to work out. And honestly, I think it's a misstep to let the audience know where Christopher Robin actually went so early on in the movie. I also just have a personal distaste for movie plots that are based on misunderstandings, because as an anxious person myself, they make me think about how all of the conflict, all of the strife and all of the trouble could have been easily avoided. And at the end, when everything gets cleared up, it just feels like we're back to square one. However, I think this movie skirts around that square one feeling in a couple of ways. First, most of the characters get their own little arcs. That's the purpose after all. They need to change and grow. That's what makes it a story in a lot of ways. So Piglet wants to feel brave, and by the end he does. Rabbit wants to feel smart, and by the end he does. Tigger wants to feel strong. You get the idea. And Pooh Bear doesn't want to feel lonely, and by the end, he doesn't feel that way anymore. By the way, Eeyore doesn't get an arc where they're deleted scenes or something. They just, he's just there. He's not a total afterthought, but it does feel a little strange or completely on the nose. Maybe it's a joke. But in addition to the character arcs, the larger arc, sort of the real focus, is centered on the relationship between Christopher Robin and Pooh Bear. Basically, this is Toy Story 3 13 years early. So when the two inevitably reunite at the end of the movie, they have a long talk about how things are different now. Christopher Robin will keep going to school and they'll keep hanging out, but they can never go back to the way things were. And you know what? This is a great segue to the movie's melancholic tone. In fact, the movie starts with this text: "Once upon the last day of a golden summer." I wrote this script on a Sunday evening, and to me, a Sunday evening is about 1/1000th of the feeling you feel on the last day of summer when you're a kid. I specifically think of like the local pool. It always closed by Labor Day, so when I was visiting right before the school year started back up, it was only depressing. It felt desperate for me to be there. Like I was in denial, like, oh, let's pretend everything's cool and I can just relax by the poolside, when internally I was just thinking, oh God, I have to deal with all that stuff again. I knew I had to go back to school and there was no getting out of it, and I did well in school. Like that wasn't the issue, but I hated it anyway, especially the lack of choice. It was just so much time for so much of the year. And when you're a really little kid, the idea of having to keep going to school for the next 12 or so years is overwhelming. Similarly, when you're a young adult graduating high school or college, the idea of committing to a full-time job for the rest of your adult life, unless you become wildly successful or wealthy, is also kind of terrifying. These aren't just normal life changes. They are normal, but they're huge life changes that end up absorbing precious hours, and most people don't have the option to avoid them, and for some, avoiding them is even worse. So it's not surprising to me that a kids movie like Pooh's Grand Adventure would try to cover this topic in the first place. What's surprising is how well the bulk of the movie captures that feeling of staring down 12 years of school or 40 plus years of work. And in addition to that, there are still dark elements of the movie. So when I was a kid, they were just viscerally dark, like surface level dark. But nowadays they have more to do with that stomach turning feeling I was just talking about. So over the course of this grand adventure, the crew find themselves in environments that just aren't what you would expect from the normal 100-acre wood. And that makes sense because by the end of the movie, they explain that all of those environments were actually just fine and very non-threatening. But because the characters were scared and intimidated and hopeless, they turned them into these nefarious spaces in their minds, so that's what we see. And that's a cute idea. It's on theme, but when the movie is actually depicting these spaces in the moment, they are genuinely unpleasant, even to an adult viewer. There's this like weird spiky forest that's completely claustrophobic in how it's drawn. Characters are squeezing through spaces. You never get a sense of a canopy at all. It's incredibly condensed. There's a classic rickety bridge over a chasm, and there's this weird crystal cavern where Pooh Bear ultimately gets trapped completely alone, and he just can't escape. And that last one in particular really stuck with me the most as a kid. Maybe it felt more sinister specifically because it didn't look that sinister, like it's bright and shiny crystals everywhere, rainbow colors, but the idea was sinister. Like, you know, like that movie within the movie, Code Unknown, if you've ever seen that one, where it's showing this lady a room in a house, and all of a sudden he says, okay, you're stuck here forever now, like I'm never gonna let you leave. This is the rest of your life.
Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire?
Ça veut dire que vous allez mourir ici.
So again, these scenes don't affect me as much anymore, kind of predictably, but also most movies don't. As a bored kid, the movie you were watching is just everything. That's your world for 80, 90 minutes, and that's definitely how it felt at the time. Of course, that always made the ending of this movie really triumphant and heartwarming. Christopher Robin shows up, everything suddenly looks nice and friendly, and the characters like themselves now, mostly. But let's talk about the animation for a little bit too. I already mentioned the director here, and this was very much a Disney movie. Specifically, I think they branded them as the Disney Toons productions. They were essentially spin-offs of established properties. Now, the lead creative work apparently happened up at the main Disney campus, but the rank and file animation production was apparently handled by Walt Disney Animation Japan, which hasn't existed since I think 2003. So, Pooh's Grand Adventure is kind of an anime, technically. Discuss. And as always, I really want to highlight the rank and file animation because while rewatching, the dominant impression that I had was, wow, there are no cut corners. No cut corners in this direct-to-video Pooh Bear movie that Disney corporate probably barely knew about. And in particular, the physicality of character animation is something that I've come to appreciate more and more in my old age. It could be the most mundane scene, which there are still a few of despite the movie's generally brisk pacing, and just watching how each of the characters moves is more than interesting enough for me. A perpetual pet peeve of mine in both live action and animation is when a bunch of characters are just standing around with no secondary action. Secondary action based, it's just what a character does either while delivering dialogue or just being in a scene. It's anything to keep a character from standing stock still and looking completely unnatural. And most good movies, most professional movies do a great job with secondary action, but in bad ones, or in actually a lot of television work, secondary action is much harder to come by. The two examples that come to mind are Parks and Rec and Bob's Burgers. If it's a dialogue-heavy scene, there is a very good chance that the rest of the cast, and maybe even the character speaking, are just standing around. They're just there. You're not supposed to be looking at them. You're just supposed to be listening to the dialogue and ignoring everything else. But when you do pay attention to those other characters, it feels very awkward. And in television animation specifically, there are reasons for that. There are money reasons, timeline reasons, but my God, comparing that kind of thing to this movie is night and day. The characters are almost always moving in some way, and they nearly always move in interesting ways. And the physicality and the personality are all part of that. Even without dialogue or like a background understanding of these characters, I completely believe that they know each other extremely well. Just the ways they interact, seemingly without thinking, it's just incredibly natural. There's a whole sequence where Piglet gets carried off by a swarm of butterflies, and there's no logical reason for it. It's so that he can learn to be braver and more self-confident. But visually, every little step of this sequence is full effort. Every part of this must have been very hard work. And so, in hindsight, Pooh's Grand Adventure, The Search for Christopher Robin, is excellent in its surface level qualities as well as its storytelling and messaging, which I think means this is a great movie. It's not groundbreaking, and it doesn't delve into the more extreme emotions that many people associate with quality filmmaking, but it's absolutely solid the whole way through, which is just not a conclusion that I was expecting from my adult self. Even so, it's a hesitant recommendation to you, the viewer. As always, it depends on who you are and what you like. If you hate Winnie the Pooh, you probably won't like this. If you're an adult who spends a lot of time online, it probably won't keep your interest. But for animation diehards or anyone who feels ambivalent toward things that they haven't seen before, it's an easy pick when you've run out of Marvel and Star Wars and Bluey on Disney+. Thank you so much for watching the entire video. I really appreciate it. New camera, slightly new setup. I'm in the process of relocating as well, but I'm happy to be back. There are also a couple hundred videos in the back catalog on this channel if you're interested in digging a little bit deeper. In the meantime, thanks for stopping by.